introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I know that's what speakers always say and they're supposed to say, but it's a genuine pleasure to be here. This is the first time that I've been to Iceland, and my brief time here has just been wonderful, thanks to some wonderful hosts and a fantastic environment. And I came over on my way from Boston to Europe and stopped in for a day, and I'm on my way home, and you're halfway in between, so it's really convenient and wonderful to stop in here. And I don't know why the airline that I flew to get here is called what it's called, but my slides aren't advancing. Hang on a second. Well, you can have a lovely view of an eagle for a few minutes if this doesn't work. Any ideas, Steiner, why that's... You probably already guessed what the airline was by the time that came up. I don't know why it's called this, but as we traveled around yesterday, I just kept finding myself saying to myself, wow, what resources. I have had such a tremendous time going around and visiting Iceland and seeing what you have here, and I have gained a tremendous appreciation for why people are coming to Iceland in droves right now. But I am a visitor, and my perspectives are those of a visitor who's only here for a brief time. I think I've been here for 4 days total, 3-4 days, and this time of year that means not very many hours in the daylight. So I haven't seen a whole lot, but I will offer some perspectives in terms of both my experience and what I've seen elsewhere. I'm always a little uncomfortable being perceived as an expert. An expert is somebody who knows a lot about one or a few things, and I, in contrast, know a little about a lot of things. I'm very fortunate in my work that I get to visit a lot of wonderful places and work with a lot of wonderful people over the course of my career. I've lost count, but I've probably worked in or closely with people in maybe half of the countries of the world, something approaching that. So what I'll be sharing with you is not so much my work or expertise, but theirs. And I am very much a visitor in many places and sharing in that regard. And I love this quote that I saw as I came in, if it's appropriate. I was asked to talk about nature conservation and tourism. Can they be harmonized? And I will get to that question, I promise. But I do want to just make some general observations about conservation globally, mostly through my work as a volunteer with the IUCN, which is an organization I presume most of you are familiar with. I am not staff, I'm a volunteer in several of the commissions, most actively in the World Commission on Protected Areas, where I chair a specialist group on privately protected areas and nature stewardship. Was very active in the Congress that happens every 10 years, the World Parks Congress in Sydney, Australia. And just a few highlights of the work that is being projected for the next 10 years in conservation, to really look at the whole gamut of conservation and protected areas. Really looking at all the different ways protected areas can be configured, the great diversity of actors that can be brought into play. Certainly the quality, and you may notice that quantity is not in there. We're really focusing not so much on expansion as effectiveness of the areas that are under protection, and reaching out to what's going on the ground in terms of voluntary conservation in many areas. And this one in the lower right here, and moving away from an expansive view of development to one of growth that is sustainable, equitable, and I like this word, satisfying economies and societies. Not my word, but. And all that for me boils down to a simple concept of stewardship. This is how we describe it in my organization, efforts to create, nurture, and enable responsibility We often talk in terms of rights, especially in my country where we're a very legalistic society. We think in legal terms and rights of individuals and organizations. Stewardship is the other half of that equation, the responsibility that comes with ownership and use of resources. I'm here because your colleague Andres heard my presentation at the Land Life Congress about a year ago in Barcelona. I've been advising a group working in the European Union to promote this concept of stewardship in Europe. And I guess he liked what he heard. So he invited me to come and visit. And as I mentioned, I have a particular interest in privately protected areas. We have a lot of land trusts where I live. Very interested in how we promote lots of different ways of protecting areas. And as a result, I'm fascinated by what I saw and heard about yesterday. I'm used to dealing with a lot of landowners, both in the sense of communal ownership of properties or lots of individuals that own a single property. I have not encountered a lot of landowners owning a single property, such as you have here in many instances. And I'm fascinated, will be fascinated to learn how you manage to adapt from a land tenure system that developed in the main for extensive agriculture to deal with the current reality of very intensive tourism development, which seems to be the predominant theme. So there's going to be a shift there that will be interesting for someone like me to observe. Another thing we're very interested in is trying to get away from a site-based approach to conservation to taking a more holistic landscape view. We talk about large landscape conservation and have been pulling together people who have that experience. And large doesn't just mean geographic extent, it also means temporally, over time. It means sectorially, conservation connecting with transportation, energy, infrastructure, tourism, all of those things. How do we do more than talk about that? How do we engage in meaningful ways? We as facilitators in the line of work that I do is just putting people together to try to learn from best practice and experience. You can Google online this report that we did on a major conference last fall. Pride of authorship, perhaps, but I think in a few pages it describes very well what's going on in our country in terms of expanding horizons and conservation. So I'm an American. You probably expect me to talk about U.S. national parks, so I will. Probably spend about half of my time partnering with our national parks across the country from a base in the only national park in Vermont, Marsh, Billings, Rockefeller. Have a very, very privileged position to work with this Stewardship Institute, which is tasked to look at the history of conservation in the U.S. and abroad, current practice, and looking ahead to the future. Where are national parks going, and trying to share that information with the rest of the National Park Service. Most people, certainly abroad and also in the U.S., have kind of a fixed idea of what our national parks are like. It tends to center around our large, iconic national parks, predominantly in the West, places you may have heard about, probably have heard about, perhaps even visited, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Olympic Glacier, Acadia National Park in the East. These are relatively large areas, relatively natural, managed by a ranger in a uniform, and providing services to individuals on the site. And that is the national parks, but it's not all of it. That roughly describes about 59 units of the national park system. There are now over 400, and they are increasingly diverse in terms of their size, their location, their naturalness. Many of these sites now are in urban areas where the people are. And it's complemented by a large number and a growing number of programs that exist outside and connected to the units themselves in particular rivers and trails conservation assistance that helps communities in conservation, and national heritage areas, which are very large areas where a lot of people actually live, that tries to connect natural resource conservation with cultural heritage values as well. I'd love to talk to you about that in great detail, but we want to reserve some time for conversation. And we hold a lot of critical conversations through the Stewardship Institute. We're very interested in how national parks can partner outside of their boundaries and sometimes inside their boundaries with others. And obviously that relates to the theme that I've been asked to talk about in terms of tourism. Tourism certainly has played an important role in our national parks and all of our protected areas from the very beginning. Most people don't recognize or appreciate just how much tourism played a role in even the creation of the national park idea. Our national parks started in the middle of the 19th century when railroads were the dominant feature of our economy. And those railroads carried not only freight, but people. And they needed destinations for those people. A classic example is the one on the bottom here, Banff National Park, the Canadian Pacific Railroad. The trains didn't run quite as fast back then. They needed a destination for their people to stop on their way across the vast Canadian continent. And that's a major reason that Banff National Park was created. You see Lake Louise, the iconic CP Hotel in the park. Now, nothing wrong with tourism being an important part. In fact, Yellowstone Park, probably our most iconic of the icons, was initially managed by an entity created specifically for it called the Yellowstone Park Improvement Company. And by improvement, they meant tourism development, hotels, carriageways, eventually roads, and for quite some time the parks were developing into essentially outdoor theme parks, and developed quite a bit along those lines in the early years. And my cartoon here would be an extreme of where that progression might have gone if it had continued. And also a feature of the parks at that time is that they were managed independently of each other. There was almost no connection between the parks. They were not seen as anything like a system for really the first 40 to 50 years. And as the number of parks grew and the recognition of the national park idea, which was really new, grew, the government began to understand, a lot of abuses happened while the parks were being developed for tourism. On the right here, a lot of animals that were perceived to be attractive for visitors were being artificially baited into areas where tourists would go. Populations of the animals they wanted were artificially increased, and on the other side, animals that were perceived as we say, varmints, critters that people might not want to see, were being eliminated in some parks, close to extirpated, and the national natural parks were becoming quite unnatural. And as you can see in the picture, a lot of infrastructure development to make it as convenient as possible for visitors to get into the parks with various kinds of vehicles. So that went on willy-nilly for 30 to 40 years, and until the National Park Service was formed in 1916 to really take these parks and start managing them more for the nature that originally attracted those visitors in the first place. And so they have this mandate to, you can read it there, to protect the values of these places for their inherent value, but also, and continue to this day, though the Park Service has changed over the years, continuing to do so for the enjoyment of the American public and visiting public as well. It's a major generalization, but in the main, Americans love their national parks. They may not like the federal government, but they tend to have a special place in their hearts for the national parks. That doesn't necessarily translate into material support for the management. So at the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service, a major campaign called Mission 66 was launched to cement in people's minds that these are special places and they should value them, and the idea by extension they should support them. And by that time, which was 1966, middle of the 20th century, railroads had been replaced by trucks and automobiles, and correspondingly the campaign heavily promoted using personal automobiles in particular to get to the parks. And I'm old enough, I'm sorry to say, to even remember the jingle of "See the USA in your Chevrolet." A lot of emphasis to get Americans in their cars and into the parks. The 66 does not refer to your clothing company, which I noticed is 66. It's a play on both the year 1966 and our most famous highway, Route 66, that goes across the country. Again, very heavy emphasis on automobiles. Next year we are now trying to get people into the parks but without their automobiles as much as possible. And in some of the larger parks, using free shuttle buses and off-site parking to make sure that it's convenient and affordable for Americans of all kinds to get into the parks, but do it in a more sustainable way through a variety of mechanisms, and the most obvious, the one that's easiest to show in a picture, through free shuttle buses like this. And this one, by the way, in Acadia National Park, is sponsored by a corporation, an outdoor equipment company, which defrays the cost. So next year is the centennial of the National Park Service, and there is a similar campaign called Find Your Park to, again, make sure that parks remain relevant and interesting to people who look like me, a white aging male. And unfortunately, that's largely the demographic of the visitors of our national parks. And a big part of that campaign is to relate to all kinds of communities of Americans and similarly to foreign visitors. I was asked to talk about creation of new national parks and some of the issues that relate to that. And I immediately sprang to mind the example of one that's close to home in the state of Maine. I live in New England, the northeast part of the U.S., and it's an ongoing issue right now. An individual, as you can read here, hope you can read it, yeah, Roxanne Quimby. She is a philanthropist. She started a skincare business based on beeswax products called Burt's Bees. You may have even heard of it. She's very successful, became quite wealthy, and decided to give something back to the nature that supported her business success. So she bought up, it says 100,000 acres here, it's actually more closer to 150,000 acres, about 60,000 hectares of land in the very middle, you might say the central highlands of Maine. And to give you a reference point, Maine is geographically almost not quite as big as Iceland. So that's the approximate scale that we're working at here. And she wanted to just buy the land and donate it to the National Park Service to be used as a national park. It may sound strange to you, but we actually have a long tradition of private philanthropy creating and supporting parks. But you would think that everybody would be really happy about that. Well, they weren't. The area in question is populated, though sparsely populated. One of the most economically depressed areas of the country, dependent very largely on the wood products industry, pulpwood for paper in particular. Most of that business has gone to other countries where it's cheaper, and the mills have closed, tremendous unemployment. You'd think a national park idea be welcomed with open arms, but there was more opposition than support, mostly based on fear and misunderstanding of what was being proposed. People very fearful, of the federal government, of Big Brother, just very generally, but also fearful of loss of their traditional usage of the land for fishing and hunting, snowmobiling in particular, and not a perception that a national park would actually make all of that use completely off limits. And it's taken quite a number of years of dialogue, and you saw in the previous picture, the son of the donor has really worked hard to engage with these local communities, a lot of informal discussions, a lot of talking back and forth, and finding common ground and talking about what are the ultimate objectives of the conservation here. And one of the ironies is that big green blotch, Baxter State Park, it's not a national park, it's state administered, but it's effectively the same thing, was created in exactly the same way 3 generations ago. Then Governor Baxter of Maine bought up that huge amount of real estate, probably 100,000 hectares, I would guess, and gave it to the people of Maine for forever, for recreational use. And just a point of interest, it is that mountain Katahdin there, one of our most famous mountains, is the terminus for the longest through hike we have in the country. I did the conversion, 3,200 kilometers or so of through hike from all along the eastern seaboard, and it ends at the summit of Katahdin there. So a very prized conservation area. So this is a work in progress. The compromise proposal that's on the table is that roughly half of the land would go into national park and the other half would become an area also administered by the Park Service, but as a national recreation area, which would imply fewer restrictions on things like hunting, fishing, snowmobiling. And we'll see if it works, but the main point of the story is that no matter the details, what has really been important is that engagement, transparency, relationship building with real people, flesh and blood people, face to face, which has been important, difficult, but essential work in that process. So I want to take you to a very different place for a few minutes. Watching the clock, so if I start talking really fast and too fast, slow me down. I do want to make sure we save time for discussion. To Costa Rica, and you may think that quite strange. What did Costa Rica possibly have in common with Iceland? A very different place, smaller geographically, much larger population-wise, absolutely no glaciers. But as I was reminded, one thing in common is there's no standing army in Costa Rica or in Iceland. But more to the point, also a spike in tourism, and in particular, tourism that is based on the nature of the place. So there may be some things that relate. One difference, Windows is messed with the, Windows doesn't seem to like Spanish in this presentation. One difference is that the spike in tourism has been going on longer in Costa Rica for about 30 years. And in total, they've seen about a 600% increase in non-resident visitation to Costa Rica in just 3 decades. And I also want to talk about it because one of the things that Costa Rica recognized early on and has done a good job at is making sure that they protect the nature that tourism is based on. That's primarily through a system of protected areas and corridors that connect those protected areas. You can see the map in the upper right. A couple of individuals, Alvaro Amaño and Mario Bosa, went to a program that our Park Service used to run, the International Seminar on Protected Areas. They got the bug, they came back to Costa Rica and convinced a lot of people that they needed to go this direction, and established some systems. Again, I'm glossing over a lot of detail here, but created ways for the tourism that the nature attracts helps to pay for managing that nature that they're dependent on. And they have lots of mechanisms that try to make sure that tourism is sustainable with the nature, using some principles that are starting to become codified and standardized globally. And again, for details, you can go to lots of different sources. This is just one, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, where you can find a good deal more information than I have time to tell you right now. But the main point is that they've had two major successes. One is on the ground, in on-the-ground conservation, but perhaps even more pertinent, they've done a brilliant job of branding themselves as not only a nature destination, but a conservation destination. And while the reality is not perfect, the brand is pretty shiny, and people very much recognize Costa Rica as a place where nature exists and is cared for. So what does all that mean for Iceland? Well, again, I'm a brief visitor. It's not for me to tell you, you draw your own conclusions, but I was asked to give a few impressions from the little that I've seen here. Iceland certainly is recognized and promoted as a nature destination. Even the in-flight safety demonstration is an outdoor recreation video. I was fascinated to see that on my flight here from Rome. But what kind of nature is Iceland promoting or going to promote? The unique, cared for nature perception and reality, or the wild in the sense of anything goes? And those are two very different things, and for one that needs to be carefully thought about. Hopefully it's the former, and if so, the conservation sector, if I can call it that, and the tourism sector need to recognize their interdependence. They certainly need to be independent. We don't want to, they need to be independent. I'll leave it there. And in order to be independent but interdependent, there need to be feedback loops. What one does needs to affect the other, and vice versa. And those are in all areas. And in terms of management, I'm assuming most of you come from the nature conservation side, as do I. We need to learn that no is not always the right answer. We in nature conservation are very good at saying no. 15 years ago, I was working in the Czech Republic when Šumava National Park was designated, very much with a wilderness mindset, wilderness model. And they forbade everything in the park other than walking, essentially, including mushroom hunting. And if you know anything about Central Europe, mushroom hunting is second only to football or maybe beer drinking as a national pastime. It was crazy to try to keep people from mushroom hunting. Also, there was a cemetery deep in the forest, and they prohibited visitation to the cemetery. You can imagine the sort of animosities that created. And they've been stepping back from those extreme positions ever since. Just one example. Certainly, sustainable tourism has limits. Yes is not always the answer either. But where are those limits? What are those limits will always be a topic of conversation and intense debate. And you must decide. The important thing is that you have those conversations and that they are legitimate, not personal conversations, and that there are fora for those conversations to take place. Financing of protected areas. I heard a lot about debates about fees for visitors, collecting fees for going into both public and private sites. I don't know how you would do that. Your landscapes are so open, many of them are so huge with so many entry points, just a practical matter. But more importantly, entry fees, they may be part of the answer, but they're not the whole answer. In our national parks, even the biggest and most visited, visitor fees amount to maybe 10 or 15% of the management budget. So it's could be part of the solution, but don't consider it the solution. And there can be, local economic feedback loops too. That park that I mentioned in Vermont, where I spend a lot of time, is part of a system, a local system that was set up by the donor of the property. You have the national park. Right next door is a historically model agricultural farm, so historical that it's now a museum of agriculture. And in the village you have wonderful inn, very popular, and other businesses that are run by a nonprofit foundation. And the foundation also runs the museum. Profits from both run the museum, but also defray the maintenance costs for the national park. And of course, the national park attracts the visitors that stay at the end, and you have a loop. And it's very, very effective. Other examples in East and Southern Africa, some of the best managed protected areas are private reserves, either for non-consumptive wildlife use, photo safaris, and the inns and the services that are associated with that are run by private organizations. And they're better protected because they have the funds to pay for the rangers and the management. Unfortunately, in much of Africa, the biggest threats are poaching incursions, and it takes boots on the ground to protect them. By offering these tourism services themselves, the reserves themselves, they're able to pay for the protection that's necessary. And also consumptive wildlife use in the case of game reserves, where there is sustainable harvesting of wildlife. Another example in the country of Belize, which I know particularly well. I've been working there a lot in the last 18 years or so. Fantastic, second largest reef in the world. About 2/3 of Belize is in protected areas, which is great, but it's also a huge management burden. How do you pay for all of that? They do it not by entrance fees or anything like that. They, like Iceland, most of their visitors are non-resident. They're foreign visitors, and they have an exit tax. So people who have come and they've seen the resource and they've had a great time, they don't mind paying the tax on the way out to support the conservation. That money goes into a conservation trust called the Protected Area Conservation Trust, and then is redistributed to the managers of the protected areas, which are both government agencies and non-governmental organizations in the United States. And it's a model that more and more countries are using. I thought I'd throw in one graph in detail so that I look like I know what I'm talking about. I don't expect you to read all of this, but a lot of people are starting to look at what are funding mechanisms that work. How do you set up these feedback loops? Essentially, it's all about how do you capture some small part of the economic benefits derived from tourism, feed that back into the management of the resource upon which that tourism depends. And again, for a whole lot more, you can go to conservationfinance.org. There are 2 different finance networks. You can find both of them if you Google, but tremendous amount of information and detail there if you're interested in that sort of thing. Some other observations from what I saw on the ground. Seems to be a lot of interest in getting people just as close as possible to the resource. Again, my sample size is very small, but I saw a lot of parking lots that go right up to the resource. I don't know why. Most of the people that got out of the cars are very able-bodied. Again, you have to make provision for people who are not able-bodied, but in the main, you know, it detracts from the experience for everybody to have them so close. I was really struck by that. And just a lot of, and I understand that you're reacting to a tidal wave, perhaps I could even say an eruption of tourism, but a lot of hasty development of infrastructure, kind of straight line stuff. And the impression that I take away is that, in a funny way, Iceland seems to be creating a massive conveyor belt designed to bring as many people to as many places as quickly as possible. And I think it may be time to stop and take a deep breath and say, is that really what we want to be doing? And obviously there are impacts on the physical environment, but also on the experience, and about ultimately on that brand thing of what are you showing the world that you're doing with these, again, fantastic resources. And I was quite struck yesterday, I think it was yesterday, a very uncommon opportunity for me, probably very common for you, but walking in a lava field somewhere in the north of Iceland. And it was very interesting for me to be walking on land that is younger than I am. I just found that extraordinary. And no offense to my hosts, we were going to lots of places and seeing lots of things. I would have loved to have lingered and just contemplated that for a while. And if I were to brand conservation in Iceland, and it's not my place to do so, but my mind turns in these ways, I would really, play on this idea that the earth is being created in Iceland on an almost daily basis. And I think a lot of the root of the term recreation, which really comes from recreation. When our parks were being established, a lot of the people who were driving for them were looking for a transcendental experience of going in and reconnecting to nature and recreating their own sense of humanity. And I'm hooked. I will be back to Iceland, I can guarantee you, because it is a great place to get in touch with nature, and it's certainly something that you want to preserve for not only visitors, but for yourselves. A few other things, safety. This image doesn't show one kind of safety, which you shouldn't take for granted, and that's personal safety. Again, my sample size is small, but I've personally felt very safe everywhere I've been. I go to a lot of places where I hide my wallet in the front, and I avoid dark places, and I don't express overtly that I'm American. I have felt extremely safe here. But the other kind of safety is, you have a lot of environments that are dangerous, that are precipitous drops and ice and lots of dangerous conditions. You now have people coming who have no idea how to work and walk and behave in those conditions. And even in a few hours, I saw lots of examples of visitors not observing. We had a park official who was shepherding people back away from the precipice, but a lot of times there aren't rangers here. And a lot of quick work to try to create infrastructure to keep people safe, which is all to the good, but there's no replacement for having people on site, making sure that people are safe and also interpreting what they're doing. You have some great people who do that, and I was very fortunate to meet a number of them. There aren't nearly enough, and again, this is where the financing comes in. You need a mechanism to have more people out there. As you have more visitors, you need more people out there taking care of them. It's just that simple. And also struck that almost everybody in this picture works for a different agency, different conservation agency. And no offense, but Iceland just isn't that big. And I think there are just opportunities perhaps for consolidation and making everything more effective. I'll leave it at that. And so if there were any advice that I would give you, it would be to not look at a site-by-site basis or which parking lot where, but to really take a holistic view of the almost emergency we're in of responding to this sudden growth in tourism, and take a very systematic approach and look at the whole system. It's not foolish to say look at Iceland as a whole as you respond to the needs of tourism development. So if I answered the question, nature conservation and tourism, can they be harmonized? Well, actually, one of your own answered it better than I did. I can, I think, if Google Translate serves me well, because I don't speak Icelandic. Someone commented in the announcement to this event in this way, and I think said it better than I could, though I might summarize it a little bit just to say that, yes, they can. It's just a question of will, organization, and vision. So I think that is quite enough from me. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention.